How's it going, artists? So today we're going to be finishing up our watercolor architecture project. Up until now, it has not been a watercolor project yet. You have been working on watercolor paper, but you might not understand what the next step is, okay? So after we have gone through, we've drawn out our whole two-point perspective scene, we've inked it as well, and we erased the pencil lines. Then we're gonna have, the fun part is, I think, well, perspective is fun too. We're going to be going through and watercoloring our project, okay? There's a certain couple things you need to learn before we watercolor. One is that if you get your watercolor trays, you should notice there is no black. There's no little black pot of paint in there or a black little cube of paint if it's a little travel tray. We don't need black for this, okay? I'll be showing you guys how to mix black. And we're going to be using everything else using vivid colors and complements, okay? So we're going to be definitely needing the color wheels. In the art room here, there are 2 color wheels. If not, there are plenty online, but looking at color wheels to be able to determine the complements is really going to help. And I'll be showing you guys how mixing watercolor paints can make the black that you need rather than just using black for everything, okay? So we're going to go ahead and get right into it now. Okay, so I'm in the top-down view here, and I'm just going to give you an overview of what I got on my desk, okay? I have a couple things. First, I have, just a little bit of tissue or maybe a little paper towel. That's going to be important to have. If you make any mistakes, you can quickly dab it up. I have my watercolor palette. Yours probably looks similar to this. It looks used, still totally great. Never need a new one of these. Even if there's colors on top of there, does not really affect what I'm going to be making with this. I have a cup of water. This one's pretty nice. It's a little spill proof. You can close it, I guess. I don't want to mess with it too much while being above my, I close it right here. So it prevents it from spilling. That's really nice. One thing that hopefully you guys are sort of getting from my tone is that watercolor is hard, and spilling and making mistakes and not having a tissue or something ready can be really bad, okay? If we spill water on this, there is a ways that it won't be able to be fixed. Watercolor is hardcore. You guys might not be aware, but it is tough, and there's a lot of really respectable famous artists out there that use watercolor, but only because they are so aware of the risks at any given time. If we were just drawing this, we could erase it. If we were doing oil painting, we'd paint over it. A lot of mediums are forgiving when we make a mistake. Watercolor, it's more about hiding than erasing whenever we make a mistake, okay? You'll definitely understand that as we go through this project, okay? I also have these 2 test strips, okay? They're just used, I don't know who painted these. They're used pieces of watercolor paper, the same as here, okay? Testing your color is important, okay? You might see me coming around your class being like, where's your test strip? Where's your test strip? Where's your test strip, okay? I want to know what your test strips are, okay? Oh, and one more thing we forgot to include is that we need to have our idea of what we're going to be painting, right? So we have already finished our color version of our sketch, if I can find it right here. And this is going to be, kind of an idea of what I'm going to be doing. I might, switch up the colors a little bit here and there, but I'm more or less happy with this. I might go ahead and make this a little more orange, and maybe I'll just mark that. I'll just make a mental note, because I don't want everything to be the same color. I want there to be differences in color, okay? And additionally, you'll probably notice that the sky has a little bit of pencil marks, but it has no inking marks. I'm gonna do the sky as I go here, and you'll see kind of why I don't want to allow too many marks back there, because it's gonna be a big sort of watercolor wash to it, okay? All right, let's get right into the watercolor method. So the method with watercolor essentially is that we do not need to use black watercolor paint, okay? If you look at I'm actually going to remove this from play here a little bit. If you look at my watercolor palette here, you'll notice that there are 2 missing pots, or at least there should be. Those are both the black pots of paint. We're not going to be using those because black does not really exist in nature. And you guys might be saying, well, what about space? You're kind of right. Space, large portions of space have the complete and utter lack of light. But as we see things through atmosphere, which unless you are outside of the planet, you will see things through a layer of atmosphere, nothing is black. Everything just sort of has a tone to it, right? Nothing's ever black or white on this as we see things, We want to make sure that our painting reflects that, and great watercolor paintings definitely have that. So I'm not going to be going through and using black, but I can make black, okay? Now, we could spend a whole term going over color theory, but actually what I'm going to do is I'm just going to give you a little bit of a trick to make black, okay? I'm gonna get my paintbrush wet here. Always nice to work on a little bit of a wet surface, so I've made this a little wet. Hopefully you guys can see that. And I'm going to go through and use this blue, which is more of a cobalt blue. Apply that, liberally in there. Okay, wash my brush by sort of making sure it goes all the way down and my bristles open up in the bottom of there. It's okay if it's a little blue. It's not really that big of a deal. Then I'm going to grab this burnt sienna. Okay, this is a more reddish brown, and I'm going to mix it together. And as I mix it, you're definitely thinking, why would you mix brown and blue together? But if we take a step back and blink and look again, it's more or less gray, right? It's a little browner, so I can add a little more blue. But what I've made here is a sort of version of gray. Maybe a little more burnt sienna. It's kind of a dance. You go back and forth until you get what you need. Maybe a little more water. Right? Gray. And if I'm ever curious on what that looks like, I'll use my test strip and put it down there, okay? For all intents and purposes, that's going to be my black for this painting, okay? I'll be mixing these two together to make the black, okay? And I'll be using it as I see fit to go through and add shadows and highlights to this painting, okay? That's going to be what we're going to be using, okay? There are other techniques we're going to be going through as we go through painting our project, but for making black, that's what we're going to use, okay? So if I were to go through and fill out an area, let's say if I were just to use a pure color, which we don't really, you guys can, but if you want to think about watercolor in the future, you don't really want to use a pure color all the time, okay? If I'm going through, and as you can tell, I didn't have enough water to really make a whole square here. It kind of ran out. That's fine. I more or less want it to be dry because I want to paint over it next with this black. And you can see that I can go through and add, shadows on top of there while it's, use that as my dark red, the black on top of it. Or I can even mix it with red. Okay? There's a couple other areas you should be aware of is that working with wet areas is important. Okay, I'm going to go to this other test strip. This is already here when I got here, but I'm just going to leave it there. Let's say, for example, I'm working on the sky. Okay, putting a layer of water. Maybe you can see it on the camera better than I can. Putting a layer of water is really nice because it allows us to let color spread out. Right? We'll let the color spread out. Let's say I wanted to add a little bit of blue up here. I can mix a little blue in my palette. I can just sort of drop it in, or I can layer it in, and it'll spread out nice and evenly, okay? Maybe I want a little red in the corner. Okay, I can just kind of pop in here, add it in, and it'll spread out to that nice, that nice value that I want, okay? Maybe a little yellow, some bright yellow down here. Okay, when I use water and I paint with water, the paint will go off the brush in a sort of, even way, a predictable way, but it'll eventually spread out and diffuse across the whole area, okay? Definitely sensitive to being picked up in this area, okay? Because if I pick it up, as you can tell, the red's going to start to run down, the blue's going to run down, the yellow's going to hit the bottom. We might have a little bit of an issue there. So we always want to leave a watercolor painting more or less flat. If you're confused on what something looks like, try to avoid holding it up to show it to me, okay? Because it could let things drip. We always want to leave it flat. Just raise your hand and I'll come over and see it. But essentially, that's what we're going to be doing, okay? That's more or less the very, very, very basics of watercoloring. There are definitely so much more to learn, but for the intents of, what we're going to be doing for this project, that's essentially going to be it, okay? We're going to be filling it in with the colors we see. We're going to be working lighter to darker and larger to smaller, okay? And I'll actually throw up a quick little drawing that you guys can put in your sketchbook. I'll actually be able to draw it for you just here, okay? Basically, for the method of our drawings, you want to imagine a pyramid. Where do we start building when we build a pyramid, okay? We don't start at the top, of course. We have to start at the bottom, start the foundation, okay? So we're going to begin with big areas, okay? Using a big brush to fill in large areas like the sky, the sides of the buildings, filling it in maybe over other colors that'll be darker, okay? Because we'll be using light colors in the very, very beginning, okay? And because you're using big areas and light colors, we're probably going to be using big brushes. That'll be on the third side of our pyramid in the back there, right? Okay, and gradually as we get closer and closer to being finished, being this is the finishing point, this when we know we're done building the pyramid, we go to smaller areas. We go to deep colors or vivid colors, right? And eventually using small brushes. So starting off, you know, if you're working on this size with about this big of a brush, might be a little too small, okay? We might want to come in with a much bigger brush to fill in those areas, okay? And I don't think I have one just on hand here, but more or less something like this is fine. Using it to fill in those large areas is more or less what we want, okay? So we're going to be going through, and I'm going to be periodically stopping while I'm painting this architectural landscape and talking about why I made some of the decisions I made, okay? Just be aware that watercolor is quite a deep and, you know, at its core, maybe we've done, you know, basics watercolor here and there in primary before, but as we start to get into the more advanced version of watercolor, we're going to learn a little more about how these things work, right? And how, you know, every little thing can have different effects, right? Like scrubbing too much with water on this thing obviously made the paper pulp come up, okay? And that's not something we always want either. But those kind of things happen, and the more we watercolor, the more we'll understand what to do with this information, what to do when we run into these problems, okay? So let's go ahead and get started right into it. So I've adjusted the view a little bit just so you guys can hopefully see my palette as well. I'm going to have my watercolor test strip here just on bay 2. Where we're going to be starting, okay? Again, looking back at our little graphic here, a little crude, I understand, but we're going to be starting with big areas with light colors, okay? Using a big brush. So what does that mean? What's the biggest area on here? You might not think about it, but it's definitely the sky, okay? The sky is a large blue area, okay? Now, looking at a reference is nice. I have an idea already. You can just Google sky and pick one you like that more or less fits your perspective points. There are so many different options to choose from, but I'm definitely just going to pick something that I think looks pretty. It really doesn't matter all that much. We more or less are all going to be working on our buildings in the daytime. If you want to do sunset or you want to do nighttime, definitely just try to make sure that you are sticking to that through the whole project, because we'll definitely be pulling the sky color back into different areas. But we're going to be starting with just a plain old blue sky here. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to get my brush wet. Okay, I'm going to make a large amount of it over here, just on top of the palette here. And I think I'm just going to pull from this, okay? Pull from this nice cerulean blue, that kind of aqua water blue. Lots of water. Little bit of color, okay? If we're thinking consistency here, maybe like tea, or, you know, like a light tea, okay? Not really thick, but not water, of course. There's a little bit of pigment in there to give it a little bit of character, okay? So I'm going to be going over and testing this on a paper. That works for me, okay? So I'm going to first, actually, before going through and putting the value on there, I want to work with a wet area. So I'm going to, you know, there's a little bit of blue in this pigment, but that's okay. I'm going to be filling this whole thing in as carefully as possible around my border. With this large watercolor area. Okay, you might see me really globbing some water on here, but that's because I intend to lightly push it all over the place. I want to try to get it all in one go, okay? That's always my goal. Does it always happen? Not always. But it is a time-sensitive thing. What does that mean? That means that when it dries, it needs to be wet again. And if it's going to be constantly wet and dried again, the paper could become a little weaker. Okay, so we want to be careful of that. Some of you guys might really have to angle your viewing points to be able to see the whole paper here. But I think we have it wet now. Okay, so I'm going to start coming with my blue, being a little sensitive of time. I'm going to start putting this in here, okay? Now, I'm going to put a very light blue over the whole thing because even though clouds are definitely white, um, they do have a little bit of blue to them, okay? So I'm actually just going to put a little bit of color over this whole thing. And, part of me just thinks I can probably just freehand these clouds. We can just make it up a little as you go, as long as you're looking at some references. Maybe I have, clouds at the top, or I go through and I sort of work from the top and have clouds somewhere here in the middle. I mean, you'll notice that it is wet paint, so it kind of makes clouds on its own. To make it look more realistic, though, definitely can really push it up to the edge of the buildings here. Don't be too afraid if you go off the edge into the into what you have in over here, or if you go into the buildings themselves. It's pretty easy to remove watercolor paints with your tissue. Or if we get little splatters, we definitely want to try to fix them, but more or less, maybe I want a streakiness over here. It's still wet, so I still have a lot to work with. Give it the illusion that it's really going back over there. Obviously the water started to dry in this area, and my paper is definitely getting a little bit warped. That's okay, because we're going to be working on it periodically as we go through, and that's expected. Looking at this, I don't know how I feel about it at the moment. I think it's okay. I'm not feeling too jazzed about this blue here, especially if it looks a little too rushed. I think I might just fill in the top part of here. Something we can also do, a little bit of a trick, is you can come in and erase a little bit. Have fun with it. I'm not a big fan of sponging, but this is more or less sponging. Something you'll notice, these little pips, these little pulps coming up. That's when we know it's about time to stop working with an area and let it dry and recover, okay? I think that's where we're going to leave this one. So now we have our sky done, okay? There is going to be an element of waiting in here, okay? Because I can't work on any area next to the sky. I could definitely, while it's wet, push the sky in those little nooks and crannies just so I have it, all even. But I'm not going to be painting a building next to the sky. There we go. Because it's going to bleed over. If I put a red color right here, it's going to bleed right into the sky, and that's going to be a pain because it's going to be a pain to fix it, okay? Fixing a large area is a little more difficult. Let's say if I want to just fix this half, without only making it darker, it's hard to go lighter in an even way, okay? So at this point, I'm just going to wait for this to dry, and then we're going to move on to the next step. Okay, so my sky layer has dried by now. I think I'm going to make a little more progress on painting some of the details with maybe these larger areas, okay? And, oops, I accidentally just went ahead and put a little water there. It really doesn't matter too much, though, So something I want to challenge you guys to do is try to give your building some texture, okay? A lot of you guys live in Hong Kong. Well, I mean, all of you guys live in Hong Kong. But you'll maybe walk around and see, sides of buildings kind of ruined a little bit or stained because of the rain is dripping down, or maybe there's a crack, or maybe there's some sort of discoloration on it. Buildings have character. We live in them. We use them. And unless they're brand new, they get worn in. And I think definitely all the buildings in my example here are fairly worn in. And I want to kind of show that. So What I'm going to do is I'm going to pretty much go over these areas where it's more or less the same color. And while it's wet, I'm going to alter its look a little bit, okay? And you guys will see what I'm talking about. So first I want to mix the color that I'm going to be mainly using. I kind of want a beige-ish color here. My source photo that I used, it's white. But I want a more of a beige and warmer color. So I think I'm going to go over here and I'm going to start with this, clean off this yellow over here. Clean my brush again, that's way too much. And you know what, in general, I'll say this, I'm doing it for the video, but do not mix your colors right over your painting. You want to do it separately. You want to kind of have a color mixing station and then the painting over here. I'm doing it on top just so you guys can see what I'm doing. My watercolor is, just off. My water cup here is just off camera, but I don't want you guys to make the mistake of moving some stuff on here onto your pin. You don't want it. So I'm looking over here. This is a sort of a bright yellow. I'm going to mix basically a very light orange, I think. So maybe a little bit of this warmer brown color. Mixing it, just kind of playing through some ideas. I kind of like that kind of cream color. Maybe even just this right here. There's definitely a push to not just use the plain color out of the box, but you could always use a color as a base and work from there. I'm going to move this over here so I'm not getting anything on there. So I'm going to put some water on here. Actually going to clean this up because there was a little bit of residue in there before. You guys might have the same issue. Get some water. Nice base here. Get some of this cream color. Maybe a little bit of burnt sienna here. It's kind of warmer brown. Yeah, I like that. I think that's going to be good. Okay, I think it's going to be a nice subtle color. Maybe a little more brown. Ooh, that's a lot more. We'll see if that's a big difference. That is. Okay. It's alright, a little more water. Making a lot of this, unfortunately. A little more cream here. Sometimes you can't go back and you just gotta start over, but I think that'll be okay. I think that's gonna be fine. Actually, I'm gonna go ahead and go with that. So then what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna move this. I'm basically gonna try to fill in this first house here, and you're gonna see more or less. I want to make it a wetter area, so I'm gonna put some water down, and I'm gonna spread it around. And you might notice that I go over the lines in some areas because I'm not too concerned with painting outside the lines that much. It is a big deal. I mean, you don't want to do it on purpose, but with watercolor, because I'm working so light in these initial areas, it doesn't really matter all that much if some of my color leaves the area. Now, I'm using this little white brush. I'm actually finding I have to really redip my water quite a bit. So maybe we'll have to use a little more watercolor oriented brushes in the future, but we'll have to revisit that later. Now I'm going to go in and apply my color. You'll notice it really does spread around quite easily. It's not a bad color. A little earthy. But obviously you can tell you can't see my brush strokes here because I've wet this whole thing and it smooths out quite nicely. All right, so I have my base color here, but now time-sensitive addition right here. I can add, a little bit of character to it. I could maybe make a darker, idea of maybe some stuff that's like a shadow, maybe worn away at the corner over here, and I can move in, wet my brush, try to remove it a little bit, and move these kind of streakiness around. Maybe I have my black around here, and we have a little bit of a drainage issue. just give it a little bit of character. Don't overdo it. But I kind of like just having a little bit of detail with this, okay? And when I work while it's wet, it'll come in and it'll be kind of natural. It'll be a little smooth, okay? And that's always nice to have. And I want to try to give it a little bit of character. It can be really easy to overdo it. But I think that is good enough for me, okay? Maybe a little bit of leakiness there. But I think that's good, okay? I'm just putting basic block colors on and taking advantage of using a wet area to fill it in with some little more detail, okay? Now, I'm going to let this dry, but I want to really advise you guys that, while this area is wet, I cannot work on any of these surrounding areas because there's a chance that it'll bleed into that area and it'll affect the quality of the work here, and I definitely don't want that, okay? So if I am going to continue working on another part while this is drying, and it should only take a couple minutes to dry the most, I would have to go through and work either on this area right here. I'd have to maybe skip over to this building, and then you kind of have to fill it all over the place in little bits because you don't want to work in adjacent areas. I definitely probably could come in with the same color and fill in the rest of the house here. But, and just while I still have it wet here, that's probably what I'm going to be doing next. But I definitely wouldn't work on a new color. Like if I made this, if I worked on this sort of church right here and it was a whole different color, there's a good chance it would bleed into the rest of the work here. And, I don't want that. Watercolor really likes to go ahead and blend through and make these really nice, soft areas. But it can also all blend together and become a big pain, and you have to rework it all over again, okay? So try to be careful, but if you're working light, like we are, and again, you guys see my paint here, it's very thin. It's almost like tea, and I'm even working with tea on top of a wet area, so it's even thinner. If we're working with this process, we really shouldn't run into too many problems that we can't fix later, okay? I'm going to be going over this later on with a really darker paint to try to accentuate some of these details and give it even more character and another pass through on top, but that's going to be later on, okay? And those are fine details that are hard to mess up when you're really working so small. So I'm going to go ahead and continue working on this, and we'll see how far we can get. All right, so I have a pretty good foundation here going through with the the large areas of color, you know, using a bigger brush. Now I'm going into sort of the middle area where I still have areas that I left blank, but you know, these, it's like this is red and this is green, so I have to use a smaller brush. Again, not super dark, okay? Definitely a little more pigmented here, but I'm not going through and putting in those real fine details now. I'm just sort of putting in these basic colors here, okay? And as you can tell, I'm kind of switching my brushes. Brush choice is important, okay? Especially some of you guys trying to put those washes on for those background areas. You'll realize that, man, this, you know, some brushes just don't get the water where you need it. You got to use a bigger brush, okay? So yeah, at the moment I'm going through and I feel pretty good about all of this. Using a tiny brush here, but only because I want red where I want it, and I don't want to you know, I'm not too concerned about it going over the edge where the green is, because I can just always put a darker green on top later. And then I'll definitely be using a smaller brush and really getting the detail here. But yeah, I'm just going through and trying to get to the point to where I have all of my colors sorted out. That's what I want. I want a nice flat color to be over almost everything here. Definitely taking advantage of when things are wet, putting some shadow in there, and you know, making this kind of grimy and dirty. It's just kind of what I wanted. It's just character, you know. Not all Colombian architecture is grimy and dirty. Even, you know, actually my source photo, all the houses were very pristine and clean. But I like the character of you know, a lived-in house. So that's something I'm going to include in here. Definitely something that'll go in my artist statement as well. You know, when you make those decisions, be sure you're writing them down. Be sure you remember, because you want to be sure to be able to speak about them later. When we write an artist statement, we want our audience to know our thought process. So I'm going to continue in here fully and then try to get all these white areas filled in with at least some color, whether it's light or even darker. I want to get to the point to where I have a lot of base color on here. So I think I have a good. I'm almost get to the point where I can say I have a base layer and everything. There's some white spots, but I think this is going to be a good place to call this part 1 for now. Trying to avoid uploading these hour-long videos. But around here is when we can start to, okay, you know, I have big areas over large buildings here. I have a base layer on the sky. Now I'm gonna come in with my smaller brushes and put some base layers in on, you know, the trim of these areas, right, and some of the details. Not the final detail, but just a layer over smaller areas with a smaller brush, okay? I still will probably come back in with a darker red and put a little shadow under the trim here, or a little bit of grit near the floor, or some cracks in the sidewalk. Of course, you know, I'm gonna be doing a lot of detail here. And I think that's going to require a lot more layers, you know, maybe a part 2 or part 3, you know, we'll have to just see how it goes here. So that's what we're gonna call it for now. Thank you guys for watching.